From now onwards, we are going to start a new topic, and that is IFRS 16 leases. Now, what is a lease transaction and why do we need a whole standard on that? Leases are basically an arrangement where a party that is called a lessor gives its asset to another party for use, and that party is called a lessee. And in return, that party gives lessor of periodic payments, which means a party is giving an asset to another party for use, and that party in return is actually paying a consideration, paying periodic payments to the owner of that asset or the sublessor of that asset. Now, this simple transaction can actually be thought of as a rental transaction. For example, a owner is giving his property to a tenant, and that tenant is paying back rental payments to the owner. But why do we need such a huge standard for such a simple transaction? The reason is that in accounting we need to look at the substance of the transaction rather than just the form. And the substance of this transaction might be different in many cases. For example, if a lessor has provided to the lessee with an asset for a non-cancelable period of time, which means for that period of time the lessor cannot ask the asset back, and if that period is almost the entire useful life of that asset, in that case essentially the lessor has actually sold that asset to the lessee, and the payments that the lessee is making in return for that asset can be thought of as a loan payment, where a lessee might have obtained a loan from the lessor and repaid it in installments over the useful life of that asset. So we actually have to think about whether it's a simple transaction where there's a rental-like transaction, or whether the lessee has a right to use an asset for a period of time and has essentially purchased that asset for that period of time. Similarly, although it might be slightly counterintuitive at this stage, but if a lessee has obtained an asset for half of its useful life, for example, if an asset has a useful life of 10 years and the lessee has obtained it for 5 years, for a non-cancelable period of 5 years, which means the lessor have to give the asset to the lessee, and the lessee can use it for 5 years without lessor having the right to ask it back. In that case, we can also think of it as a transaction where the lessee might have purchased half the life of that asset. And in such case, it might be called a right of use asset. So all these complications, which we will be dealing with in great detail in this standard, have to do with the substance of the transaction and not just the form. So, and if the substance is really the rental case, where we can actually think of the transaction as a rent being paid against an asset, and in that case we will have to treat it as an expense. Otherwise, it might be treated in a more complicated way. It might be treated as a purchase of an asset and obtaining of a liability from the lessee point of view, and selling of an asset and giving of a loan from the lessor point of view. So basically, the standard sets out different requirements for the lessor and the lessee. So this standard has two separate parts. One is for the lessee, how the lessee would account for a lease transaction, and the other is for the lessor, how the lessor would account for a lease transaction. So let's get into the deep stuff.